November 2nd, 2023, 8:17 p.m. 26-year-old Daniel Mercer steps into the frame of a security camera outside a quiet apartment complex in Columbus, unaware that these will be the last confirmed images of him alive. The footage is clear, almost too clear. Daniel walks with purpose, keys already in hand, glancing briefly over his shoulder before reaching the entrance. Nothing appears out of place. No one follows him. No immediate threat. For weeks, investigators would replay these exact moments frame by frame, convinced they were seeing everything there was to see. But they weren't, because hidden in plain sight, buried in the background of a seemingly ordinary recording, was a detail so subtle it went completely unnoticed. A detail that didn't just change the timeline, it dismantled the entire theory of what happened that night. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. What investigators missed wasn't just important. It was everything. November 2nd, 2023, 8:17 p.m. 26-year-old Daniel Mercer steps into the frame of a security camera outside a quiet apartment complex in Columbus, unaware that these will be the last confirmed images of him alive. The footage is clear, almost too clear. Daniel walks with purpose, keys already in hand, glancing briefly over his shoulder before reaching the entrance. Nothing appears out of place. No one follows him. No immediate threat. For weeks, investigators would replay these exact moments, frame by frame, convinced they were seeing everything there was to see. But they weren't, because hidden in plain sight, buried in the background of a seemingly ordinary recording, was a detail so subtle it went completely unnoticed. A detail that didn't just change the timeline, it dismantled the entire theory of what happened that night. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. What investigators missed wasn't just important. It was everything. To understand why that detail mattered, you have to understand Daniel Mercer. Daniel wasn't the kind of person who invited risk into his life. Friends described him as structured, almost methodical. He worked as a logistics coordinator for a regional distribution company, a job that rewarded precision and punished mistakes. Every route, every schedule, every variable had to be accounted for. And Daniel was good at it. He lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, organized, and predictable. That predictability mattered to him. It was something he built deliberately after a series of unstable years in his early 20s. He had routines for everything. Morning coffee at exactly 7:10. A short walk before work, no matter the weather. Groceries every Sunday evening, always from the same store, always in the same order. Even his phone calls followed a pattern. He called his younger sister, Emily, every Tuesday and Friday. Never missed. And on the night of November 2nd, everything followed that pattern until it didn't. Earlier that evening, Daniel had left work at precisely 6:02 p.m. His co-workers would later confirm nothing unusual about his behavior. No signs of stress, no indication he felt unsafe, no change in demeanor. If anything, he seemed lighter than usual. He mentioned grabbing takeout, going home, and finally catching up on a series he'd been putting off. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary night. At 6:28 p.m., he stopped at a small Thai restaurant just 10 minutes from his apartment. The staff remembered him clearly. He was polite, patient, even joked briefly with the cashier about always ordering the same thing. Pad CEW, mild spice. He waited for his order, checked his phone, and left at 6:41 p.m. Nothing unusual. At 7:03 p.m., his car entered the parking lot of his apartment complex. This was confirmed by a separate camera positioned near the entrance. He parked in his usual spot. Same space he'd used for nearly a year. Another routine. But this is where things begin to feel slightly off. Daniel doesn't exit the car immediately. Instead, he sits there. 2 minutes pass. Then 3. From the camera's angle, you can't see his face clearly, but you can see movement. Subtle shifts. The glow of his phone screen illuminating the interior. At first, investigators assumed it was nothing. Maybe he was finishing a message. Maybe he was scrolling. Normal behavior. But later, that assumption would be questioned. At 7:07 p.m., Daniel finally steps out of the vehicle. He grabs a small takeout bag from the passenger seat, locks the car, and begins walking toward the building entrance. He doesn't rush. He doesn't hesitate. But there is something deliberate about his pace. And just before he reaches the door, he pauses. It's brief, less than a second. But he looks over his shoulder. At the time, no one thought much of it. People look over their shoulders all the time. It's instinctive, unremarkable. Except Daniel wasn't known for that kind of behavior. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't distracted. And according to everyone who knew him, he rarely deviated from his patterns without a reason. So why did he look back? Inside the building, Daniel's movements become harder to track. The interior cameras were limited, outdated, and partially obstructed. Investigators could confirm he entered the lobby. They could see him approach the elevator. But after that, the footage becomes inconsistent. By 7:10 p.m., he is no longer clearly visible. And after that, nothing. No confirmed footage of him reaching his apartment. No recorded exit from the building. No calls, no messages, no activity. It was as if he simply stopped existing. When Daniel didn't answer his usual Friday call 2 days later, his sister noticed immediately. At first, she assumed he was busy. Maybe he'd fallen asleep early. But by Saturday afternoon, concern turned into something heavier. She drove to his apartment. His car was still there. His takeout container, unopened, was later found inside. And Daniel Mercer was gone. No signs of forced entry. No obvious struggle. No indication that anything violent had occurred inside the apartment itself. Just absence. Clean. Unexplained. Unsettling. Investigators were called in that same evening. Missing persons quickly escalated into something more serious. Because adults don't just vanish without leaving a trace, especially not someone like Daniel. They started where they always start. The cameras. Every available angle. Every second of footage. Every movement leading up to the moment he disappeared. And on the surface, it all seemed straightforward. Daniel arrives. Daniel enters. Daniel disappears. Case closed, at least in terms of visible movement. But something about it didn't sit right. There were no gaps in the timeline that made sense. No clear opportunity for someone to approach him. No visible suspect. No forced interaction. It was too clean, too quiet, too perfect. And that's when the investigation began to narrow. Because when there's no obvious external threat, attention turns inward. Who had access to the building? Who knew Daniel's routine? Who could move unnoticed within those walls? The focus shifted to people close to him. Neighbors, co-workers, anyone who might have had a reason or an opportunity. But even as theories formed and suspicions grew, one piece of evidence remained at the center of everything. That single camera angle. The one that showed Daniel walking toward the entrance. The one investigators believed they had already understood completely. They would watch it again, and again, and again, for weeks, not realizing that the answer wasn't in what Daniel was doing. It was in something else entirely, something no one had been looking at. And when someone finally noticed it, everything changed. The investigation moves quickly in the first 48 hours. Detectives canvass the building, knocking on every door, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. Did you see Daniel that night? Did you hear anything unusual? Did anything feel off? Most answers are the same. No, nothing. But surveillance doesn't rely on memory. It relies on precision. And in a case with no witnesses, cameras become everything. Investigators begin constructing a timeline using every available angle. At 7:03 p.m., Daniel's car enters the lot. At 7:05 p.m., the vehicle is stationary. Interior movement is visible. At 7:07 p.m., he exits, takeout bag in hand. At 7:08 p.m., he approaches the building entrance. This is where the primary camera captures him in full view. The timestamp reads 7:08 and 16 seconds p.m. Daniel walks from the lower left of the frame toward the glass entry door. His posture is upright. His stride is steady. He reaches into his pocket, pulls out his keys before he even gets to the door. Prepared. Routine. At 7:08 and 21 seconds p.m., he slows slightly. At 7:08 and 23 seconds p.m., he pauses. And at 7:08 and 24 seconds p.m., he turns his head, just enough to look behind him. Then he continues forward and disappears inside. At first, investigators log it as incidental behavior, but this is where everything should still make sense, because the next camera, positioned inside the lobby, picks him up at 7:08 and 31 seconds p.m. Same clothing, same bag, same pace. He walks across the tiled floor toward the elevator. No one else is visible. No one enters behind him. No one exits in front of him. At 7:08 and 44 seconds p.m., he presses the elevator button. At 7:08 and 52 seconds p.m., the doors open. He steps inside. And at 7:08 and 55 seconds p.m., the elevator doors close. That is the last confirmed moment Daniel Mercer is seen on camera. From there, investigators attempt to track what should be a simple sequence. The elevator should arrive at his floor. A hallway camera should capture him exiting. A second camera near his unit should show him entering his apartment. But none of that footage exists. The hallway camera on his floor had been malfunctioning for weeks. Maintenance records confirm it. No recording. No backup. A blind spot. At first, it's frustrating, but not suspicious, because everything up to that point appears consistent. There's no visible interference. No sign of another person entering the elevator with him. So investigators focus on the most likely scenario. Something happened after he reached his floor, inside the building, inside that blind spot. And that assumption begins to shape everything that follows. They start looking at residents on Daniel's floor. One name surfaces quickly. Marcus Hale, 31 years old. Lives 2 units down from Daniel. Works irregular hours. Prior complaints from neighbors about noise. Nothing violent, but enough to make him noticeable. More importantly, Marcus has no solid alibi for the night of November 2nd. He claims he was home, alone. No visitors, no calls, no activity that can be independently verified. Investigators bring him in for questioning. At first, he's cooperative, calm, almost indifferent. He says he didn't see Daniel that night, didn't hear anything unusual, didn't leave his apartment. But there's something about his tone that investigators find difficult to ignore. Not fear, not defensiveness, just detachment. And in cases like this, detachment can be interpreted in many ways. As pressure builds, inconsistencies begin to emerge. Marcus initially states he went to sleep around 10 p.m. Later, he says it might have been closer to midnight. Small discrepancies, but enough to raise suspicion. Investigators obtain a search warrant. They go through his apartment carefully, looking for anything, clothing fibers, signs of struggle, anything that could tie him to Daniel's disappearance. They find nothing conclusive, but they do find something ambiguous. A set of freshly washed clothes, still damp. Marcus claims he spilled something earlier that day and needed to clean them. It's not evidence of a crime, but it's enough to keep attention on him. Meanwhile, Daniel's apartment is processed. Inside, everything appears undisturbed. His wallet is on the counter. His keys are missing, likely still with him. The takeout container sits unopened on the kitchen surface. His phone is nowhere to be found. No signs of forced entry. No visible disturbance. It looks like someone came home and then never settled in, which doesn't make sense, because Daniel was predictable. He didn't leave food untouched. He didn't disappear without explanation. And yet, every piece of evidence seems to point in one direction. Something happened inside that building after 7:08 p.m. with no witnesses and no cameras. By the second week, the case begins to narrow even further. Pressure builds on Marcus Hale. Detectives revisit his statements, reanalyze his timeline, look for anything they might have missed. Eventually, prosecutors decide there's enough circumstantial evidence to move forward. Marcus is arrested, charged in connection with Daniel Mercer's disappearance, presumed homicide. The case gains attention. Local media begins covering it closely. A neighbor suspected. A missing man. A building with a blind spot. It fits, at least on the surface. But even as the case moves toward trial, something continues to bother a small group within the investigative team. Because the entire theory depends on one assumption: that Daniel made it safely to his floor. That everything after the elevator happened out of view, unrecorded, unseen. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if the timeline itself was flawed? Because there is one piece of footage they keep coming back to. That exterior camera. The one at 7:08 p.m. The one they believed they had already exhausted. They watch Daniel walk to the door. They watch him pause. They watch him glance back. Again and again. Nothing new. Nothing obvious. Until one investigator decides to stop watching Daniel and starts watching everything else. The edges of the frame. The reflections. The background. Because sometimes the most important detail isn't where everyone is looking. It's where no one thought to look at all. And hidden in that overlooked space is something that doesn't fit the story. Something that shouldn't be there. And once it's seen, the entire case begins to collapse. By the time the case reaches its fourth week, most of the investigative team believes they are close to a resolution. Marcus Hale has been arrested. The narrative feels complete. A neighbor with no alibi. A missing man. A malfunctioning camera creating the perfect blind spot. But not everyone is convinced. Detective Laura Bennett had spent nearly a decade working cases that looked simple on the surface, and rarely were. She wasn't assigned as the lead investigator on Daniel Mercer's case, but she had been part of the review team from the beginning, and something about the timeline never sat right with her. Not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. So while the rest of the department focused on building a case against Marcus, Bennett went back to the beginning. The footage. Again. But this time, she changed one thing. She stopped following Daniel and started watching the frame. The entire frame. Every corner. Every reflection. Every movement that wasn't immediately obvious. At first, nothing stood out. The same sequence. The same movements. The same uneventful walk toward the door. 7:08 and 16 seconds p.m. Daniel enters frame. 7:08 and 21 seconds p.m. He slows. 7:08 and 24 seconds p.m. He looks back. But Bennett doesn't rewind immediately. She lets the footage play a few seconds longer than everyone else had. And that's when she sees it. Not in front of Daniel. Not behind him. But reflected. The glass door of the building, slightly tinted, acts like a faint mirror. It's subtle, easy to ignore, especially if you're focused on the subject walking toward it. But in that reflection, just for a fraction of a second, something moves. A shape, a figure, too far back to be obvious, too distorted to be immediately identifiable, but unmistakably there. Someone is already behind him, and not where they should be. Because when Bennett rewinds and slows the footage down frame by frame, the detail becomes clearer. At 7:08 and 22 seconds p.m., before Daniel even turns his head, the reflection shows a person stepping into view from the side of the building. Not from the parking lot, not from behind Daniel, but from a narrow walkway that runs along the edge of the complex, an area just outside the camera's direct field of view. A blind angle. The same figure never appears directly in the frame, only in the reflection, which is why no one noticed. Because everyone was watching Daniel, and not what the glass was quietly revealing. But this is where everything changes. Because if someone was already approaching from that direction, then Daniel wasn't alone when he reached the door. And more importantly, he knew it. That brief pause, that glance over his shoulder, it wasn't random. It was awareness. Bennett takes the footage to the team. At first, there's resistance. The image is unclear. The figure is indistinct. Defense attorneys could argue it's nothing more than distortion or shadow. But Bennett pushes further. She requests additional footage from nearby cameras, street angles, adjacent buildings, anything that might capture that side walkway. And eventually, they find it. A traffic camera positioned 2 blocks away, partially obstructed by trees, captures a narrow view of the same path leading toward the apartment complex. At 7:06 p.m., a person appears, hooded, walking quickly, head down. Not enough to identify a face, but enough to establish movement. The direction matches, the timing aligns, and most importantly, this individual is not Marcus Hale, which means the entire case has been built on a false assumption. Marcus is released, quietly. The charges are dropped before trial, and the investigation resets. But now, they're looking in a completely different direction. Because the question is no longer what happened inside the building. It's what happened before Daniel ever made it there. Bennett returns to the footage again, this time mapping the timing between the exterior camera and the lobby. 7 seconds. That's the gap between Daniel entering the building and appearing inside. 7 seconds where the camera outside loses him. 7 seconds that were never questioned. Until now. Because if someone was already close behind him, they could have reached the door at nearly the same time. And if that person didn't need a key, then they didn't need to be visible for long. Investigators begin examining access logs, key fob entries, maintenance overrides, emergency access points. And that's when another detail surfaces. 3 days before Daniel disappeared, a temporary access code was issued for a maintenance contractor. Work order listed as routine inspection. The contractor signed in, but never signed out, and no one verified whether the code had been deactivated. When investigators trace the contractor's identity, they find something unexpected. The name is real, the credentials are valid, but the individual never showed up for work that day. Someone else used that access. Someone who now had a way into the building without needing to be seen. Phone records begin to fill in the gaps. Daniel received a call while sitting in his car. Those 2 minutes before he stepped out. The number is unregistered. Burner phone. Short conversation. 43 seconds. And whatever was said during that call changed his behavior. Because when investigators enhance the footage, they notice something subtle. Daniel isn't just sitting. He's listening. Still. Focused. And when the call ends, he hesitates before getting out of the car, as if deciding something, or preparing for it. The theory begins to take shape. Someone contacted him, directed him, positioned themselves along that side walkway. Out of view, waiting. By the time Daniel approaches the entrance, he already knows someone is there, which explains the glance, but not what happens next. Because Daniel does make it inside. That part is real. But what no one considered is how quickly someone else could follow. Close enough to avoid detection. Far enough to remain just outside the camera's focus. Inside the lobby footage, there's a detail almost no one noticed. At 7:08 and 33 seconds p.m., just 2 seconds after Daniel enters, the glass door shifts again. Barely. Not fully opening. Just enough movement to suggest someone passing through quickly. Too fast to register clearly. Too subtle to trigger concern. But now, in context, it means everything. Because Daniel wasn't alone in that elevator. He just wasn't visibly accompanied. Further analysis of elevator mechanics reveals something critical. Weight sensors. The system logs indicate a load slightly higher than Daniel's known weight. Not by much, but enough to suggest a second person. Unaccounted for. And with that, the entire timeline rewrites itself. The confrontation didn't happen on the hallway. It didn't happen inside the apartment. It happened in transit, between floors, in a space with no cameras, no witnesses, and no way out except through cooperation. Investigators eventually identify the suspect through a combination of digital tracing and access code usage. A former subcontractor with knowledge of the building's layout. Someone who had worked there months prior. Someone who knew exactly where the cameras were, and more importantly, where they weren't. The motive is tied to something smaller than expected. A financial dispute. A shipment Daniel had flagged weeks earlier in his logistics role. A loss that cost someone money. Enough to create anger. Enough to plan. The suspect is arrested 6 weeks after Daniel disappeared. And while Daniel himself is never found, the evidence is enough. The timeline, the footage, the reflection, the detail no one saw until someone finally looked in the right place. In the end, it wasn't a missing frame or a broken camera that solved the case. It was a reflection, a single, overlooked moment that had been there the entire time. Quiet, unnoticed, waiting. Because sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's just ignored. And the difference between the two is everything. If there's one thing this case leaves behind, it's this. Never assume you've seen the full picture. Because the detail that changes everything is often the one no one thinks to look for.